ladies and gentlemen. What I want to do today is, and it would have been nice if William had explained in that flood of carefully scripted eloquence, that we gave the title of my talk, I seem to remember, Conservatism,
Near-death experience.
a near-death experience. And I think we need to begin with that idea. I like to begin with something else. Whenever I do history, I'm interested in things and places. The great difference between myself and my very great teacher, who was himself a student in this place, Geoffrey Elton, back in the 1950s, is that we had a sense of the reality of the past, the thinginess of the past. History is more than mere words. Far too much of the history we teach is merely playing with words and a kind of verbal embroidery. So what I want to begin with is what maybe some of you even watched it on television this morning, late this morning, the King's Speech, the state opening of Parliament. What is it there for? Why do we have it? Does it matter? And the reason I want to talk about that is that it seems to me that what we have seen since 1997, since the new Labour government of 1997, right up to the present, is effectively 25 years of quasi-revolution, which has effectively demolished and deliberately disintegrated the historic constitution of Britain as it was reformulated first in 1660 with the Restoration, and again in 1689 with the Glorious Revolution. And in other words, what I'm going to be suggesting is that we have had a period of overt revolution under New Labour. And secondly, we've had something much worse. We've had a slinking, supple, Michael Gove-esque prolongation of this thing under conservatism, and that we are reaping the catastrophic consequences. In other words, as conservatives, we should fundamentally be aware of the idea of a constitution. This is something you will never, ever hear from central office. No conservative politician, with the possible exception of someone like Rees-Mogg, has ever talked about it in the last 20 or 30 years. Yet, nevertheless, it is central. Why do I say it's central? Britain, England, is unique in many respects. But I think in the most important respect, Britain is the only country that consciously, deliberately, and without foreign intervention or direct military crisis reverses a revolution. We have forgotten what happens in 1660. Britain, the Kingdom of Great Britain, the United, which of course actually becomes the entire British Isles, thanks to the conquest by Cromwell, experiences in the 17th century a revolution as radical as that of France. There is a more, I took friends around Westminster Abbey last week, there is a more radical destruction of the royal regalia in England in the 17th century than there was in France at the end of the 18th century. Partly, of course, it's because by the time you've got to the end of the 18th century, you have a sense of the past, you have a sense of history, you have a desire to create a museum, even if it's a past that's hated. So the main de justice of Charlemagne and whatever, the elements of the great medieval regalia of France even survives the depredations of Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety and whatever. Not so in England. So the revolution in England is an astonishingly radical one. It aspires not simply, remember, to cut the head off of the king, which it does, pioneering a public trial and a public execution of a king. It aspires to remove the very name from the language. Even the King's Highway, whatever, everything is renamed. So it is of astonishing radicalness. And what's even more interesting, of course, is that the removal of the king was promptly followed by the removal of Parliament. You obliterate a pre-existing constitution, which, remember, had substantially continued. We do need to remember this ever since the 13th century. We have Therefore, what we inherited, what Blair inherited in 1997, was elements which remained unchanged from the High Middle Ages. This seems to me to be absolutely fundamental, and what we as conservatives should attach ourselves to. Basically, what was it? Why did they restore in 1660? Why did they re-restore in 1689? Why did we see this morning the echoes of that, now largely an empty shell? The state opening of Parliament looks exactly as it did at the beginning of the reign of Elizabeth I, but Elizabeth II. But the substance has gone. And it's that evacuation of substance that seems to me to be so disastrous, and why what I would like to suggest the Conservative Party needs to do. It will, of course, be demolished. It will suffer much the same fate as the monarchy in 1649, I imagine, at the next election. Whether that involves the actual execution, the beheading of Rishi, who knows, either by the opposition or maybe by his own, but what's left of his own backbenchers. But there will be an astonishing change. What should the aspiration be? I think the aspiration should be for a new restoration. A second restoration. Now, let me try and explain why I think that's necessary. What the old Constitution did, the Constitution that it essentially, in its essential aspects, and if we go back to that ceremony this morning, there was the monarch, there was the consort, there were the peers, the judges, and the commons at the bar of the house. The only thing that would have been different in the Middle Ages is that the monarch would not have had the consort by him. It would have always been a him, of course. He would have had instead the Archbishop of Canterbury on his right hand and the Archbishop of York on his left hand, with the primacy of the church, which is, of course, destroyed by Henry VIII and the Parliament, the Act of Precedence of 1539-40. But what that Parliament represented and why it matters so much was described by the judges as early as the 14th century. They say everybody is bound by an Act of Parliament because everybody is construed to be represented there either in person or by his representative. That is in about 1340. This is long before any concept of democracy, but it is the highly developed sense of representative government and a government which finally some way is answerable, that is not simply government from above, but is government that responds to those below, and that government is a communal enterprise, and that the thing that, as it were, symbolizes that enterprise is debate. Discussion about the two vital aspects of government, which is raising money on the one hand and passing laws on the other. All the subject of debate, all the subject of vote, right? Now, that seems to me to be fundamentally how human affairs should be conducted. Remember, many of you, I'm sure, do papers on political thought. The two great opposed figures in the history of political thought are Plato on the one hand and Aristotle on the other. Plato thinks that government is primarily a matter of expertise. It's primarily a matter of knowledge and training. Aristotle has got this wonderful phrase, which I think should be pinned to all of us. The badge on our jackets and the badge on our hearts and the badge on whatever is the female equivalent. And it is that the judge of a meal is not the cook, it is the eater. That seems to me to be the central issue that we should have, as it were, as a mirror of government, as a mirror of how government should properly be conducted. And that essentially, it seems to me, is how Britain was governed for hundreds and hundreds of years. And the thing that's really striking is how that pattern is, if you like, modernized. If you look at the processes of social change, of the rise of different groups, economically empowered or socially empowered, or whatever it is, in every other European country, it requires to accommodate them some process or another of revolution, however violent. After 1689, in Britain, the story is a very different one. Whether you look at Chartism in the 1830s, whether you look at the broadening pressure to represent the male working class in the later 19th century, whether you look at the struggle to accommodate women, nobody is trying to bring the system down. What they're trying to do is to become part of it, to become part of that representative assembly, to have the right to sit in it and have the right to vote for it. In other words, you're dealing not with, if you like, revolution at all, you're dealing with a broadening and incorporation. And it seems to me that is why the scene that we saw this morning is still there. Why it's in a building which is deliberately built. Look where we are now. We're in the Wilkins building. Do we all know who Wilkins is? The greatest architects of the early 19th century. This is a building constructed under the influence of Jeremy Bentham and the extraordinary reform movement of the early 19th century, which is designed to be clean, modern, structured, designed. Okay, look at the building where the state opening of Parliament took place. It is almost exactly contemporary with this. But what does it look like? It looks as near medieval as they could make it. This is there because what they were doing consciously was to say that freedom, that representative government, that the rule of law, that the security of property, everything that made Britain, England particularly, the pioneering country in modernity and economic growth, is not the creation of a specific moment, is not the creation of a written constitution. It is, good conservatives, we know this, good Burkeans, we know this, it is the creation of the hand of time. It is intrinsic. It is of historic growth. What happens in 1997 is, of course, Tony Blair comes along and feels the hand of history upon his shoulder, and I'm afraid it wasn't Cleo the Muse, it was some fraudulent whore that touched him, because what you do instead is decide that this is terribly old-fashioned, it's deeply, deeply boring, and wouldn't it be nice if we invented Britain to look like a newly enfranchised ex-satellite of the Soviet Union, with a reach-me-down international constitution, complete with bills of rights and other such nonsense. The key issue is the idea of the separation of powers. Do we all know who invents the idea? Montesquieu. Who is Montesquieu? He is a tiresome French aristocrat. It is an absolute rule that all bad ideas are French. And Montesquieu is one of the clearest, de l'esprit des lois is one of the clearest examples of this. Montesquieu is supposed to have got the idea of separation of powers from Britain, and he spends indeed 2 years in Britain. He never bothers to learn English. He spends the whole of his time mingling in aristocratic circles that speak French, and the only inkling that he has of anything going on in England is from strange people like Viscount Bolingbroke and the idea of the Patriot King, where he lifts this extraordinary idea from. If you actually look at what goes on, and this can be proved, by the way, this is serious scholarship. If you actually look at what was arrayed before you in the Parliament chamber this morning, there was never any separation of powers in Britain. Parliament was the Supreme Court. It exercised power over judicature. It exercised power over finance. It exercised power over religion. It was both the executive and it was the legislative. And if you look there, there is the king, there are the judges, there are the bishops, there's the aristocracy, there's the House of Commons. There was never any separation of powers. And if you come to think about it, how can there be a separation of powers in England when the office of Prime Minister, in other words, the chief of the executive, the person who is the sort of substitute monarch? Remember, Japan had the system of a real monarch and of a nominal monarch, the Mikado and the Shogun, even with two completely separate capitals. The equivalent of the Shogun in Britain is the Prime Minister. And what does he do? The head of the executive actually sits in the legislative and has to manage it. And this is, of course, the reason that Britain has been able to maintain a parliamentary system, whereas virtually no other country can, because through the Prime Minister, you actually manage a representative chamber. Chambers of 600 people can't govern. As we saw very clearly when Bercow tried to recreate the role of Speaker Lenthal in the early stages of the Civil War in England in 1640, you cannot do it. Instead, the role of the Prime Minister is to manage the monarch on behalf of Parliament and Parliament on behalf of the monarch. So you, first of all, the first disaster under New Labour is you begin to introduce elements of a separation of powers. You hive off a Supreme Court, and you immediately see the problem of this, in which you refer a decision of the Prime Minister controlling a majority in the Commons, or in that case, a bare majority in the Commons, to the Supreme Court. So you actually have judges overruling the chief executive, who is in fact a product of a general election and the support of a general election. A disaster. You do something else, of course. You separate out the ancient office of Lord Chancellor. You decide you can't have the ancient office of Lord Chancellor because he was the head of the judiciary, but he was also a politician and he sat in the cabinet. We say this is a terribly bad thing. So we dethrone the Lord Chancellor and semi-abolish him. Do you think the current chaos of justice, the current fact that we talk of increased sentences, we don't actually have courts that can sentence, we don't have prison, we don't have cells to put the prisoners in. The disgraceful chaos of justice that we have at the moment would have been inconceivable in the days of the old Lord Chancellors, be it on the Labour side or somebody like Mackay of Clashfern, who is Thatcher's great Chancellor. But much worse than this, much worse than even the separation of powers, is of course the fragmentation of the United Kingdom with devolution. Remember, the only point of union between England and Scotland was Parliament. There's no other point of union. The Act of Union of 1707 leaves Scotland with all the lineaments of separate nationhood, apart from the monarchy and Parliament. Scotland is left with its own system of law, its own religion. The monarch changes religion when they cross the border, with its own system of heraldry, with its own right to issue coinage, which is why there are unusable Scottish notes, which you get people turn their noses up at them in London, and so on and so on. An educational system, universities, which are entrenched by the Act of Union, and so on and so on. So you actually fragment the union. But the worst thing that happens, and I think I will make this point and then we'll open this thing up. What has happened and why? So the fact that Parliament is now acutely dysfunctional for these reasons. But the thing that is the most dysfunctional aspect of it all were two. One of them is the incorporation of the Human Rights Act and the Convention on Human Rights into English law. Do we all understand that there is a fundamental contradiction between the notion of universal human rights and the sovereignty of the state? These are absolute logical contradictories that cannot be held together, which is why Jeremy Bentham, who founds this college, describes doctrines of universal human rights as nonsense on stilts. We can explore that, but there is a total contradiction between the idea of a nation state and the notion of universal humanity and universal human rights. So you do that, so you introduce a very powerful element, which, remember, is a deeply destructive, because it's also combined with the Equality Act. One of the greatest principles of the old English Constitution was equality before the law, that all laws apply equally to everybody. What we've done since the Labour government, the new Labour government, is to introduce sectional laws that protect people by religion, protect people by race, that fragment and disintegrate. This is catastrophic. And finally, the worst of them all, and I wish I could blame it entirely on New Labour, but I'm afraid the Tories have a terrible burden of responsibility. Since the 1960s, we have fragmented government more and more into the quasi-autonomous non-governmental organisations, the quangos. Parliament and the government decide almost nothing that matters. Interest rates are determined by the monetary policy of the Bank of England. The utterly fundamental business of climate change is decided by a collection of self-interested maniacs, most of whom have heavy, and I'm now speaking deliberately, have heavy investments in renewables. The policy of land use is determined by another bunch of nutters, in other words, Tony Juniper and English nature. We go on and on and on. And what surely we learned with COVID was that the absolutely worst way of conducting business is by a single issue expert committee. They are only concerned with one matter. Good government depends on the balance of incommensurables, of weighing things against each other. And as we've learned, the only thing that we've learned of any use from the COVID inquiry is that nobody bothered to count the cost of lockdown. Nobody bothered to ask the question, what is the benefit? Cui bono. And until we do that, we're lost. And I think we are lost until this process, this need for reconstruction, this need for a re-engagement, a reanimation, a restoration of the past takes place.